Unusual details on Johnny Carson's most recent performance. America bid farewell to the man who had taken care of them for 30 years on May 22, 1992. The Tonight Show's last episode, hosted by Johnny Carson, marked more than just the conclusion of a show. It was the end of a time that will never come again. It was one of the most watched television spectacles ever, with over 55 million people behind the standing ovations, the tears, and Carson's renownedly modest departure, however, were unspoken details, last-minute adjustments, and backstage dramas that the audience was unaware of until years later. The final show, which seemed so well planned on TV, was actually a complicated labyrinth of covert choices, emotional outbursts, and meticulously protected preparations that nearly collapsed several times. What the cameras? According to a former NBC executive who attended the finale, the footage taken that evening only represented roughly 60% of what truly transpired. The rest, the disputes, the unexpected visitors who were denied entry, the video that was later purposefully deleted. That is the tale that has never been recounted in its entirety. We're revealing the odd, unexpected, and occasionally startling facts of Johnny Carson's renowned farewell broadcast today. The hidden backstory behind the most well-known farewell on television. The entire production almost collapsed due to an emotional breakdown, which the celebrities were prohibited from attending. These are the little-known tales that alter our perception of a crucial period in American cultural history. Let's examine the most closely kept secret of all first, though. The true reason for Carson's decision to make May 2020 his last date was a personal tragedy that influenced every aspect of his farewell broadcast. We just have tonight and tomorrow before I leave. God, I am number 10, the enigmatic time choice. Nearly a year before his last program, Johnny Carson announced his retirement, giving NBC plenty of time to get ready for the decade's biggest television event. However, network executives who had pushed for a conclusion during the more lucrative February sweeps period, when advertising rates are decided, were perplexed by the precise choice of May 2020, 1992 as the last airing date. According to a former NBC scheduling official, Johnny was usually quite understanding when it came to business matters, but he was totally set in his ways when it came to the final date. He refused to give anyone other than the show's producer, Fred de Cordova, an explanation for why May 2020 was non-negotiable. Until years after Carson's passing, when his longtime friend and lawyer, Henry Bushkin, disclosed the devastating truth, the date's importance was unknown. Richard, Carson's son, was born on May 2020 and passed away in a vehicle accident in 1991. The show's end featured Carson's personal homage to his son, which he concealed from nearly all of the participants. In a later interview, Bushkin noted that Johnny was never one to show his feelings in public. Richard wanted to give the event a personal touch while preserving his anonymity, so he planned the climax for his birthday. It typified his approach to grieving, accepting it in ways that only he completely comprehended. Carson's renownedly stoic departure was given heartbreaking context by this intimate remembrance. Viewers were unaware that the date itself held such deep personal significance, a secret layer of meaning that Carson purposefully kept hidden from his inner circle while they watched his tearful but calm final moments on television. According to a production assistant who worked on the show, understanding the significance of the date helps explain why Johnny was so extraordinarily involved in every aspect of the final broadcast. For him, this was more than just a professional turning point. It was entwined with his personal life's most agonizing loss. There are comedians and comics in this profession, and occasionally there is number 9, the last secret guest that never materialized. Robin Williams and B appeared in the last episode of Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. Fans and television historians are well aware that Midler was the final official visitor. Few people are aware that just hours before the show was to air, Carson ordered the cancellation of another surprise guest who had been covertly planned to follow Midler. A former NBC page who was working that evening disclosed that a last surprise guest was planned, which would have been historic television. There was a special dressing room set up that none of the regular personnel was permitted to access. Security was doubled, and the staircases on either side of the stage were kept clear. Former President Ronald Reagan was the mystery guest. According to several people who were there that evening, he had been carried to the studio covertly via an underground parking entrance. The proposal, which was arranged through secret channels without NBC's knowledge, intended for Reagan to surprise the audience by handing Carson a Presidential Medal of Freedom during the last segment. The medal was authentic. According to a former White House aide aware with the plan, the presentation was intended to be a total surprise, coordinated between Reagan's people and a few of Carson's most trusted employees, even though it had been approved through formal channels. Johnny wanted everyone to be genuinely surprised, so he kept the network in the dark. When Carson found out, the scheduled appearance was canceled around 3 hours prior to taping. Those in attendance reported that he was clearly irritated that someone else had attempted to arrange a surprise element for his meticulously planned farewell performance. "Get him out of here. This is not a political convention, and I'm not taking medals from anyone tonight," Johnny told Fred when he called him to Cordova, according to a production assistant who overheard the exchange. He insisted that his departure be personal, discreet, and centered on his bond with the audience rather than on formal acknowledgement. The award was eventually given to Carson in private at his residence after Reagan was discreetly led out of the premises. The event was a reflection of Carson's well-known concern on maintaining control over his public persona and his aversion to extravagant displays, characteristics that had made him the most influential star on television for 30 years. 10,000 pieces a week, probably. Alex didn't discuss this matter with you. The missing footage controversy comes in at number 8. The fate of the video, after it was broadcast, was among the most peculiar elements of Carson's last broadcast. Significant amounts of the uncut video from Carson's finale were purposefully destroyed within days of airing, although the majority of memorable TV moments are kept safe with numerous backup copies, and nearly unheard of choice for a broadcast event of this magnitude. According to a former NBC archivist, the show was used to record with 5 cameras that night. The subsequent events, however, were not typical. With the exception of one edited master copy, all raw video was to be destroyed 3 days after the broadcast. Everything was erased, including commercial break exchanges, pre-show content, and multiple camera viewpoints. Through his production business, Carson Productions, which controlled the program's rights, Carson personally ordered this extraordinary destruction. Carson was worried that footage of him at emotionally sensitive moments that didn't make the final broadcast might be used in unapproved documentaries or retrospectives, according to people involved with the decision. A camera operator who worked the final show disclosed that there were moments between commercial breaks when Johnny was obviously distraught. A side of himself he never wanted the world to witness. Following his performance, Midler had to pause for over 2 minutes to gather his thoughts before continuing. He insisted on keeping those times confidential. With no other views or longer video accessible, even for historical purposes, the deletion of the tape has resulted in an odd position where one of television's most important events only survives in its broadcast form. The sole surviving footage, according to NBC archivists, is the identical show as it was aired, plus roughly 15 minutes of Ed McMahon's uncut introduction. According to a television historian, it's unusual for a television event of this size. Carson's departure has more surviving raw film than even the moon landing. Even after he completely departed television, it demonstrates his immense dominance at NBC and his obsessive need to maintain control over his public image. The Doc Severson fall comes in at number 7. For many years, Doc Severson's flamboyant attire and booming trumpet were staples of The Tonight Show. He was a close buddy of the host off-camera and a member of Carson's inner circle as band leader. Hours before the broadcast, Severson experienced a partial physical collapse that almost stopped him from making an appearance at all, although viewers of the final show were unaware of this. A musician who performed in the Tonight Show band disclosed that Doc had been up for over 48 hours straight, practicing unique arrangements and attempting to polish the music for Johnny's farewell. Just passed out in the practice room around noon on the day of the final taping. A mix of emotion, fatigue, and the tremendous pressure to perform flawlessly in the last concert. After Severson's evaluation, NBC's medical personnel strongly encouraged him not to perform that evening and that Tommy Nuome, an assistant conductor, take his place. Those in attendance claim that Severson disregarded medical advice and even prevented Carson from being told about the incident. "I'm leading that band tonight unless I'm dead," he said to the doctor. A production assistant who heard the talk recalled, "Johnny doesn't need one more thing to worry about." He then requested a B12 shot, napped in his dressing room for 2 hours, and managed to gather himself together for the show. Subtle indications of Severson's condition are visible to viewers of the final program. During the broadcast, he sits down more than normal and lets other band members play trumpet solos. But there was no sign of the drama that had taken place hours before in his flamboyant appearance or the band's performance. According to a fellow musician, Doc's performance that evening was one of the most impressive demonstrations of professionalism I've ever seen, especially given his physical condition. On the most significant night of their 30-year collaboration, he was practically running on fumes and willpower, determined not to disappoint Johnny. Severson never talked about this episode in public because he believed that Carson's farewell should be the main emphasis, not his own personal battle. The close-knit group that Carson had formed throughout his 30 years on the air was exemplified by this loyalty, a group that put its leader's safety first, even at personal expense. Since Jay Leno's debut on The Tonight Show, I have been a huge fan of his. About 8 or 9 years ago, what was it? Perhaps 10 years ago, the tension backstage at Johnny Carson Jay Leno is staff number 6. Although fans saw the on-air change from Johnny Carson to Jay Leno as friendly, the backstage reality during the last shows was tense, full unpleasant interactions, and meticulously planned to maintain the arrival and departing hosts kept apart as much as feasible. An NBC page that worked on both shows during the transition period disclosed that a complex dance was taking place behind the scenes. To prevent Johnny and Jay from unintentionally bumping into each other, the production crew basically established distinct routes through the studio. Separate green rooms, separate corridors, and different elevators. It was similar to operating in separate universes within the same structure. Carson's well-documented dissatisfaction that NBC had selected Leno over David Letterman as his successor was the reason for this cautious split. Even though Carson never openly questioned the choice, the business was aware of his affinity for Letterman, which made the transition awkward. On camera, Johnny was the epitome of professionalism, but off camera, he used subtle gestures to express his emotions, according to stage manager who worked the last week. During production meetings, he never once brought up Leno's name. He would just mention the next guy or whoever comes after him when talking about the future. It was subtle but pointed. Carson in his classic form. A few hours before the final show, Lowe tried to visit Carson's dressing area to bid him well, which resulted in awkward confrontation, according to several sources. According to reports, Leno was stopped in the corridor by Helen Sanders, Carson's longtime secretary. "Johnny's preparing and doesn't want to be disturbed," Helen remarked, stopping him, according to a production assistant who saw the interaction. That was precisely how it ought to have begun. This behind-the-scenes choice to permit an unbridled, real, and emotional moment instead of heeding Carson's inclination for restraint produced one of the most iconic television openings ever and established the tone for a farewell that struck a balance between Carson's need for dignity and the sincere emotion that such a significant event deserved. Fourth, B. Midler's covert rehearsal marathon. B. Midler's heartfelt rendition of "One for My Baby and One More for the Road" is regarded as one of the most moving moments in television history. I can't believe the final guest, the final idiot, Mr. Carson, will have to endure this with pleasure. Viewers are unaware of the extraordinary lengths Midler went to behind the scenes, including a demanding 36-hour rehearsal process that nearly caused her to lose her voice before the actual broadcast. Beat was absolutely determined that this would be the performance of her lifetime, said a musical director who worked with her on the preparation. It was a perfect farewell that brought Carson to the brink of tears. 3 days prior to the broadcast, she rented a private rehearsal space and practically moved in, having a cot brought in so she could take quick naps in between rehearsals without having to leave. Several sources claim that Midler worked with 5 different arrangers, constantly adjusting the performance and rejecting a lot of different approaches before settling on the small, emotionally impactful version that finally aired. We had to put her on vocal rest for 6 hours prior to the taping, with a rigorous regimen of steam treatments and herbal remedies in an attempt to restore her voice in time, as she reportedly went through 18 different arrangements of the song before settling on the final version. A vocal coach who was brought in to help explained that by the morning of the broadcast her voice was nearly gone from the constant rehearsing. She was performing on a voice that had been pushed to its absolute limits through obsessive preparation, and the emotional crack in her voice during the final lines that seemed like spontaneous emotion was, according to those involved, partially the result of her vocal exhaustion. It was truly touch and go whether she'd be able to perform at all. This context makes Midler's flawless delivery all the more impressive. According to a production assistant who worked with both stars, B never told Johnny about any of this, which makes it even more remarkable. He was unaware of the vocal problems or the lengthy rehearsal process, and she was adamant that he saw her performance without showing any concern for her or understanding the effort that went into it. This insight gives Carson's visibly moved reaction a new meaning. That was precisely how it ought to have begun. This behind-the-scenes choice to permit an unbridled, real, and emotional moment instead of heeding Carson's inclination for restraint produced one of the most iconic television openings ever and established the tone for a farewell that struck a balance between Carson's need for dignity and the sincere emotion that such a significant event deserved. Fourth, B. Midler's covert rehearsal marathon. B. Midler's heartfelt rendition of One for My Baby and One More for the Road is regarded as one of the most moving moments in television history. I can't believe the final guest, the final idiot, Mr. Carson, will have to endure this with pleasure. Viewers are unaware of the extraordinary lengths Midler went to behind the scenes, including a demanding 36-hour rehearsal process that nearly caused her to lose her voice before the actual broadcast. Beat was absolutely determined that this would be the performance of her lifetime, said a musical director who worked with her on the preparation. It was a perfect farewell that brought Carson to the brink of tears. 3 days prior to the broadcast, she rented a private rehearsal space and practically moved in, having a cot brought in so she could take quick naps in between rehearsals without having to leave. Several sources claim that Midler worked with 5 different arrangers, constantly adjusting the performance and rejecting a lot of different approaches before settling on the small, emotionally impactful version that finally aired. We had to put her on vocal rest for 6 hours prior to the taping, with a rigorous regimen of steam treatments and herbal remedies in an attempt to restore her voice in time, as she reportedly went through 18 different arrangements of the song before settling on the final version. A vocal coach who was brought in to help explained that by the morning of the broadcast her voice was nearly gone from the constant rehearsing. She was performing on a voice that had been pushed to its absolute limits through obsessive preparation, and the emotional crack in her voice during the final lines that seemed like spontaneous emotion was, according to those involved, partially the result of her vocal exhaustion. It was truly touch and go whether she'd be able to perform at all. This context makes Midler's flawless delivery all the more impressive. According to a production assistant who worked with both stars, B never told Johnny about any of this, which makes it even more remarkable. He was unaware of the vocal problems or the lengthy rehearsal process, and she was adamant that he saw her performance without showing any concern for her or understanding the effort that went into it. This insight gives Carson's visibly moved reaction a new meaning. He was reacting not only to the emotional resonance of the song, but to an act of artistic dedication far beyond what would be expected even for such a significant television moment. It was a gift in the purest sense. She almost broke herself to create a perfect moment for someone else. A special segment that was fully produced but never aired, a compilation of farewell messages from dozens of prominent politicians and celebrities that Carson personally reviewed and then ordered destroyed without broadcast, was one of the most closely guarded secrets about Carson's final broadcast. However, I managed to get through that first night with the assistance of Groucho Marx, Rudy V. No. 3, and the destroyed celebrity messages. A producer who worked on the segment said, "It was a huge undertaking. We spent months collecting custom video messages from movie stars like Tom Hanks, Meryl Streep, and Jack Nicholson to presidents Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Bush. The final compiled piece ran about 12 minutes and would have been the most star-studded tribute in television history." The segment was finished a week before the final broadcast, and it was privately screened for Carson in his office. Johnny watched the entire thing, nodded, and then said, "It's very nice." Those in attendance said that Carson watched it silently, thanked the team for their efforts, and then shocked everyone with his response, "Put it in the vault now." After the final broadcast, Carson went one step further and demanded that all copies of the tribute be burned, rather than kept in the archives. "We're not using it," remembered an editor who worked on the project, and when people asked why, he simply replied, "That's not what this night is about." He specifically instructed that the material not be utilized in any future tributes, retrospectives, or memorial programs under any circumstances, according to internal NBC documents that have subsequently been made public. We had responses from 5 continents and dozens of the world's most famous people. But Johnny was clear. He wanted his farewell to focus on his relationship with the audience and his core team, not on celebrity connections. Carson's famous aversion to the Hollywood celebrity culture, despite his position at its center, was reflected in his decision to destroy something that so many people had contributed to. The producer acknowledged that it was heartbreaking. By turning down the celebrity tribute, he stuck to his long-held belief that his relationship with regular viewers was more important than his relationships with celebrities. A belief that had shaped his approach to television over the course of his 30-year run. With the help of any other people involved, Peter Alley, he figured that number 2, Ed McMahon's emotional breakdown, Ed McMahon's signature laugh, and unwavering support had been constants throughout Carson's 30-year run on camera during the final broadcast. Ed had been holding it together remarkably well until the final commercial break, before Johnny's farewell remarks revealed a stage manager who was present that night. Professional composure despite visible emotion. What viewers never saw was the complete emotional breakdown he experienced backstage that required medical intervention and nearly prevented him from appearing in the final segments. Something just broke when he stepped backstage for a moment, and he broke down in tears that were so bad he was having trouble breathing, the kind of uncontrollable sobbing you don't often see from a grown man, much less one with Ed's professional control and military background. The breakdown was so bad that NBC's on-site medical staff worried about McMahon's blood pressure and at first suggested he not go back on stage for the last segment. A production assistant explained that Johnny was going over his notes for the final remarks, and Fred Cordova was desperately trying to handle the situation without frightening Johnny. This created a crisis for the production team, who knew Carson would never end the show without his longtime sidekick by his side. In the end, McMahon defied medical advice and used cold compresses on his face and eyes to reduce the swelling from crying, causing genuine panic that we might have to postpone the final segment or restructure it in some way without Ed. Before he returned to the set for the broadcast's final moments, a makeup artist did what one witness called a miracle job to hide the evidence of his breakdown. If you look closely during Johnny's final remarks, you can see Ed's hands trembling despite his calm facial expression. What you see in those final minutes is Ed McMahon using every ounce of his professional skill to maintain composure, according to a colleague who witnessed both the breakdown and the broadcast. He's literally holding himself together by sheer will. The final moments between Carson and McMahon are given poignant depth by this background. Their 3-decade professional partnership came to an end when both men displayed remarkable self-control to bid the audience a farewell that felt dignified rather than maudlin, despite the intense emotion they were going through in private. The most closely guarded secret regarding Carson's final broadcast is what transpired after the cameras stopped rolling. The unbroadcast final moments in the studio, and Carson's actual last words to his staff, which were very different from his renownedly subdued on-air farewell. The first is Johnny's secret final words. The audience stayed seated after the broadcast ended, and Johnny returned to center stage for a private moment with only the crew and staff. What people don't realize is that Johnny's actual last words weren't, "I bid you a very heartfelt good night." According to a camera operator who was on set that evening, multiple people who were present claim that after the cameras stopped rolling, Carson asked the audience to stay seated and asked all network executives to leave the studio, an unprecedented request that was still respected under the circumstances. What he said there was never broadcast and never meant for the public. Carson talked for about 3 minutes without cameras recording, recalling a longtime staff writer about how television had changed during his tenure, not all for the better, and how his departure signaled the end of an era where a host could speak to America without focus groups and corporate oversight. This was after only his direct staff, crew members, and the audience were left. Then, according to those in attendance, Carson did something wholly out of character. "I hope I earned this privilege every night. I hope I never took your trust for granted, and I hope to God they remember what this was before it's all shopping channels and shouting matches." Production assistant explained. He made us all promise not to record it or speak about it publicly until after he was gone. He invited his entire staff and crew onto the stage for a group embrace, breaking the emotional reserve he had maintained throughout the broadcast, a private moment of vulnerability and connection that only those in the studio that night witnessed. "Tonight was for the viewers," he said. "We have this moment." Johnny was revealing to us a side of himself that he had purposefully kept hidden from the world during his career. The nuanced reality beneath Carson's public persona was exposed in this last unfilmed occasion. A man who cared greatly about the quality of television and the people who contributed to his show, but who kept a careful distance on camera. According to one witness, it was the true farewell, the one without the mask he had worn so casually for 30 years.